My wife left the house every Tuesday for 17 years. One day, I followed her and found out why. I want to start by saying that I am not a suspicious man. I never have been. I grew up in a small town in rural Ohio where people left their doors unlocked and trusted their neighbors with spare keys. And somewhere in the process of growing up there, I absorbed the quiet belief that the people you love deserve to be taken at their word. My father never questioned my mother. My grandfather never questioned my grandmother. The men in my family loved deeply and trusted completely, and I considered that a feature, not a flaw. So when I tell you that it took me 21 years to follow my wife on a Tuesday, I want you to understand that this is not a story about a suspicious husband finally confirming his worst fears. This is something else entirely. This is the story of how I almost let the most important thing in my life pass me by without ever understanding it, and how a single afternoon rearranged every assumption I had built my marriage on. Her name is Diane. We met in 1998 at a copy shop in Columbus where I was getting flyers printed for a band I was in. We were terrible, a three-piece that played covers of Springsteen songs to audiences of maybe 11 people, and she was behind the counter with ink on her wrist and reading glasses pushed up on her head, even though she was only 24 years old. And she made a joke about the font I had chosen for the flyer that was so specific and so quietly devastating that I laughed for about 30 seconds straight. We had coffee 2 days later. We were married in 2001. Our son Marcus was born in 2003, and our daughter Lily came along in 2006, and somewhere in the construction of that life, the mortgage, the school pickups, the arguments about whose turn it was to call the plumber, I fell into the easy habit of taking Diane for granted in the way that people who love each other without thinking about it sometimes do. The Tuesdays started in 2002. I remember the exact year because Marcus had just turned -1. He wasn't born yet. Diane was about 4 months pregnant, and she came to me on a Monday evening while I was watching a game and said, very casually, that she was going to start going out on Tuesday afternoons. She said she needed something that was hers. She said she hoped I understood. I said of course because I did understand, or at least I thought I did. She was pregnant and cooped up and working from home doing freelance graphic design, and she needed air. She needed movement. She needed something outside the four walls of the house we had just bought and were still learning to fill. I didn't ask where she was going. It didn't occur to me to ask. I trusted her. And then the years went by. Marcus was born, and the Tuesdays continued. Lily was born, and the Tuesdays continued. We moved to a bigger house in 2008 and a slightly smaller house in 2013 when the economy was being unkind to us, and through all of it Diane left every Tuesday around 1 in the afternoon and came back around 5:30 or 6, sometimes smelling faintly of coffee, sometimes with paint or marker on her hands, always a little quieter than she'd been in the morning. Not sad quiet, reflective quiet, like she'd been somewhere inside herself and was slowly coming back to the surface. I asked her once, early on, maybe 2004 or 2005, where she went. She smiled and said it was her thing, her Tuesday thing, and could it please just be that? I said sure. And I meant it. I was not hurt. I was not suspicious. I simply filed it under the category of things I didn't need to know, the way couples have whole rooms in themselves that they don't open for each other, and that's fine, that's healthy, that's what it means to still be two separate people inside a marriage. But time does something strange to a mystery you've stopped actively wondering about. It doesn't dissolve the mystery. It just layers sediment over it year after year, until one day you realize the sediment itself has become significant. By 2015, I had stopped thinking about the Tuesdays almost entirely. They were just a feature of the week, like trash day or the Sunday crossword. Diane goes out on Tuesdays. Okay, that's the thing that happens. And then one Tuesday in October of 2023, everything shifted. I had taken the day off work. I'm in facilities management for a mid-sized manufacturing company, genuinely unremarkable stuff, because I had a dentist appointment in the morning, and I just decided to roll the rest of the day into a personal day. The dentist finished early. I was home by noon, which almost never happened on a Tuesday, and I was sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee and reading something on my phone when Diane came downstairs with her bag and her jacket and her keys and stopped dead when she saw me. The look on her face lasted only a second, maybe less. But in that second, I saw something I had never seen there before, and I want to be precise about what it was because I've thought about it every day since. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't panic. It was something more like protective alarm, like a person who has a very fragile and precious thing in their hands and has just been startled and is now very carefully making sure they don't drop it. She recovered immediately. She smiled, asked how the dentist went, said she'd be back by 6, kissed me on the cheek, and left. I sat there for about 10 minutes. Then I got in my car and followed her. I stayed far enough back that she wouldn't see me. I don't know why I was sure she wouldn't check her mirrors, but I was. She drove across town, through the older neighborhoods where the houses have big oaks out front and the streets are named after Civil War generals, and she parked on a residential street called Harmon Avenue that I don't think I had ever driven down before. I pulled over half a block back and watched her get out of the car with her bag and walk up the path to a house. A yellow house, small, with flower boxes in the windows that were done for the season, just dark soil and dried stalks, and knock on the door. A woman answered, older than Diane, maybe 70. White hair cut short, glasses, a cardigan the color of oatmeal. She opened the door, and her face when she saw Diane was extraordinary. She didn't just smile. She lit up. She reached out and took Diane's hands in both of hers before Diane had even gotten through the door, and then the door closed and they were inside, and I was sitting in my car on Harmon Avenue not knowing a single thing. I drove home. I made dinner. I didn't say anything when Diane got back, because I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what I had seen. I turned it over in my mind for the rest of the evening and through most of the night, and what I kept coming back to was that face, the old woman's face when she opened the door, and how it looked less like greeting someone and more like relief, like something coming back that she had been afraid might not. I went back the following Tuesday. I didn't follow Diane this time. I just drove to Harmon Avenue early and parked and waited, and at about 1:15 Diane's car came around the corner and parked in the same spot as before, and she went up the same path and knocked on the same door, and the same woman answered with the same extraordinary face. I watched this from half a block away and felt something I can only describe as being on the outside of a window looking at a room full of warmth and light and not knowing if you're allowed to knock. I looked up the address when I got home. It took me about 4 minutes. The house on Harmon Avenue belonged to a woman named Eleanor Marsh. I Googled Eleanor Marsh and got a few results, a listing in a local directory, an old mention in a community newsletter from 2009 about a neighborhood garden project, and an obituary. The obituary was from 2019, and it was for a man named Gerald Marsh, Eleanor's husband of 44 years. According to the obituary, Gerald and Eleanor had one son, Thomas, who had died in 2001 at the age of 22. I sat with that for a long time. Then I did something I'm not proud of logistically, even though I think it was the right call morally. I went back to Harmon Avenue on a Wednesday morning, and I knocked on the door. Eleanor Marsh answered and looked at me with polite, patient eyes, and I introduced myself. I told her my name. I told her I was Diane's husband. I watched her face carefully when I said it, and she didn't flinch. She didn't look caught. She just looked thoughtful. And then she opened the door wider and asked me if I wanted to come in. Her living room was the kind of room that holds 20 years of a life in every surface. Framed photos on every shelf. Quilts folded over chair arms. A smell of coffee and something baked, maybe from that morning or maybe from the day before. She sat in the armchair that was clearly hers, worn just so, a table with a book and a phone and a coaster beside it, and I sat on the sofa, and she folded her hands in her lap and looked at me with an expression that was neither guilty nor defensive, but just very calm and very tired and very kind. I wondered when you might come, she said. I asked her what her connection to my wife was. I tried to ask it without accusation because there was no accusation in me, only this vast incomprehension, this feeling of being handed a map to a country I didn't know existed. Eleanor Marsh was quiet for a moment. Then she told me. Thomas, her son, the one who died in 2001 at 22, had been Diane's boyfriend. They had dated for almost 3 years through college and into the beginning of whatever was supposed to come after. Diane had loved him. Eleanor said this plainly, without jealousy, in the way that people who have been through enough can speak plainly about things that would have been impossible to say plainly at the time. Diane had loved Thomas, and Thomas had died in March of 2001 in a car accident on a Tuesday on a highway outside of Columbus, in weather that was bad and roads that were worse. And Diane had been the one who identified him at the hospital because his parents were 4 hours away, and she was the person they called. Diane and I started dating in 1998. We were not together when Thomas died. We had actually broken up for about 8 months somewhere in 1999 and gotten back together in early 2000, and I had never known about Thomas. I had never known because I had never asked with enough specificity, or maybe because Diane had arranged her history in careful rooms and I had been content to live in the ones she opened. After Thomas died, Eleanor said, Diane had called her. She had called her because she didn't know what else to do, because she had spent 3 days not sleeping and not eating and not telling anyone, not her parents, not her friends, not me, because we had been back together for barely a year and she didn't know how to hand me a grief that she thought I had no claim to. And finally, she had called the number she had for Thomas's parents, and Eleanor had answered, and they had talked for 4 hours. Diane and I got married 4 months later. And somehow, without my knowing it, the Tuesday visits had started before the wedding, had started in those 4 months when Diane was holding 2 enormous things at once, a loss she couldn't speak about, and a future she was walking toward, and she had needed somewhere to put the first thing so she could be fully present for the second. I asked Eleanor if she had ever thought about telling me. She said she had thought about it many times. She said she had asked Diane, maybe 6 or 7 years in, whether it wasn't time to tell her husband. She said Diane had cried and said she was afraid that if she told me, I would feel like I had been chosen second. Eleanor had pushed back on that. She said she had told Diane that wasn't how love worked, that you don't choose second place when you marry someone 22 years later, that grief and love exist on different tracks and they don't disqualify each other. But Diane, she said, was very stubborn about protecting me from pain that wasn't mine to carry. I drove home and sat in the driveway for about 20 minutes. It was a Thursday. Diane was inside, working. I could see her through the kitchen window, sitting at the table with her laptop, one leg tucked under her the way she always sits, coffee going cold beside her the way it always does. And I looked at her through that window and felt something break open in me, not break apart, not shatter, but break open, the way a geode breaks open, and there's something extraordinary inside that was hidden the whole time. I went inside. I sat across from her at the table. She looked up and said, hey, and I said, I went to see Eleanor Marsh on Wednesday. And the silence that followed was the longest of our marriage. She didn't cry right away. She just looked at me with those eyes, gray-green. I have never in 22 years been able to settle on exactly what color they are, and she looked at me for a long time like she was doing math, trying to calculate the distance between where we were and where we were about to be. And then she started talking, and she talked for almost 2 hours without stopping, and I listened to every word. She told me about Thomas. She told me what he was like, funny in a dry, quiet way, obsessed with old maps, could not parallel park to save his life, cried at dog movies without any shame whatsoever. She told me about the night he died and the hospital and the 3 days after, and how she had put everything she felt into a box and kept it on a shelf in a room she very rarely went into because she was 27 years old and she had decided to live and she had decided to love me and she had decided that grief was something she could manage by rationing it. 1 afternoon a week. 1 small yellow house on Harmon Avenue. 1 woman who understood without needing explanation, because Eleanor had her own grief, and they had been keeping each other company in it for 21 years. 2 people who had both lost the same person in different ways, sitting across from each other with coffee going cold, and understanding without explanation what it meant to still be here, when someone else wasn't. She told me she had never thought of it as a secret, not exactly. She had thought of it as a private thing. She had told herself the distinction was important. Now, sitting across from me at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking from, she said she wasn't sure the distinction held any more. I told her about the look on the old woman's face when she opened the door. I described it as best I could, that relief, that lighting up, and Diane started crying then, not because she was sad, or not only because she was sad, but because she said she had never told me about Eleanor, and she had never thought to ask herself what Eleanor's Tuesdays looked like from the inside, what it meant to Eleanor to have this person come to her house every week for 21 years, and hearing it described out loud made her understand something about what she had been to Eleanor that she hadn't understood before. We talked about Thomas for the rest of that evening. I asked her questions and she answered them, and some of the answers were hard to sit with. Not because I was jealous. I want to be clear about that. Because jealousy of a dead 22-year-old who has been gone for longer than I have been married to this woman would be a moral failure I don't think I'm capable of. But because hearing about a whole person who loved my wife, and whom my wife loved, and who I never knew existed, felt like having a room in my own house open for the first time, and realizing that the room was full of things that mattered. At some point she asked me if I was angry. I thought about it honestly, and I told her no. I told her that I understood protecting someone from pain. I told her that I probably would have done the same thing, honestly, if the situation were reversed, because we are the same kind of person that way. Diane and I, we are both in the business of absorbing things so other people don't have to. She laughed a small, wet laugh at that and said yes. And that's probably why we work. And I said yes, and that's probably also why we sometimes don't. And she nodded, and we were quiet for a while in the comfortable way that takes 20 years to build. I went to see Eleanor one more time, the following Tuesday, with Diane. I told Diane I wanted to meet her properly, not as someone who had knocked on her door with a head full of questions, but as her husband and as someone who understood now what those Tuesdays had meant. Eleanor opened the door and looked at both of us standing on her porch, and her face did the thing it did, that extraordinary lighting up, and then she looked at me for a long moment and said, "She told me you were a good man." I always believed her. We sat in that living room for 3 hours. Eleanor showed me photos of Thomas. There was one of him and Diane at somebody's birthday party, maybe 1999 or 2000, both of them mid-laugh at something off-camera, young in the specific way that people are young when they don't know yet what's coming. I held the photo for a while. I thanked Eleanor for keeping this part of my wife safe all those years, for being the place where Diane could put this thing down so she could carry everything else. Eleanor looked at me over her glasses with an expression that was very kind and slightly corrective and said, "Don't thank me." She kept me, too. Every Tuesday for 21 years, she came and she sat in that chair, and I always knew on Monday night that I had something to get to. You don't know what that does for a person. Diane still goes on Tuesdays. That hasn't changed. What's changed is that I know where she's going, and sometimes, maybe once a month, I go with her. Eleanor and I have developed something I would call a friendship if I were being modest, or something closer to a strange and tender kinship if I were being more honest. She's 81 now. She is sharp and funny and stubborn, and she reads a book a week, and she has strong opinions about coffee and about what's happened to the neighborhood since the hardware store closed. Her son Thomas, she says, had her stubbornness and her husband Gerald's kindness, and watching her say it, watching the way she holds those two things in her hands like objects she has been carrying for a long time, heavy but precious, I believe her completely. There are things I've thought about in the months since that October day that I haven't been able to stop thinking about. I think about how many people move through a single life, how many loves and losses fit in a person by the time they're in their 40s and 50s, and how we walk around thinking we know the people we sleep next to every night when really we know a room or two and the hallway. I think about how Diane spent 21 years managing a grief that she had decided was not mine to share, and how that decision, which I think came from love, cost her something, not something she seems to regret, but something real. I think about Eleanor opening that door every Tuesday for 21 years, and what it meant to have that Tuesday coming, always coming, reliable as anything in a life that had been made unreliable by loss. I think about the version of me that could have asked the question at any point in 2 decades and didn't. I don't beat myself up over it. Asking would have required suspicion I didn't have, or a curiosity I had decided to restrain out of respect. But I do think about what we lose when we stop being curious about the people we're closest to, when we let familiarity settle over a person like a dust cloth over furniture until we've stopped noticing the shape of what's underneath. Marcus is 20 now, in college in Michigan, studying something to do with environmental science. Lily is 17 and insufferably certain about everything the way 17-year-old girls are, and I love her for it. Neither of them knew any of this until about 2 months ago when Diane told them, matter-of-factly, over dinner, that they had a history they hadn't known about, and here it was. Marcus was quiet for a long time, and then ask thoughtful questions the way he does. Lily cried, and then got annoyed at herself for crying, and then asked to see the photo of Diane and Thomas at the birthday party, and looked at it for a long time, and handed it back and said, "He looks kind." And Diane said, "He was," and that was that. I don't really know how to end this because it doesn't have an ending, it has a continuation. Diane and I are the same marriage we were before October, and we are also a different one. We talk more now, or we talk differently, with less assumption that we already know what the other person is carrying. Last Tuesday, I drove her to Eleanor's and went in with her, and we sat in that little living room with the photographs on every surface and the quilts on the chair arms and the coffee going cold, and Eleanor fell asleep in her armchair about halfway through the afternoon the way she sometimes does now. And Diane and I sat there quietly in the sleeping woman's house, and I reached over and took her hand and she let me hold it, and neither of us said anything for a long time, and I thought about how 21 years of Tuesdays had been building to exactly this, the three of us in this room together, a grief finally wide enough to let someone else inside it. I followed my wife on a Tuesday and found out that she had loved someone before me and lost him and never stopped grieving him and had quietly, faithfully, for 2 decades, honored that grief in the only way she knew how, privately, carefully, without letting it touch me. And what I found out about my wife is that she is larger than I knew, more complicated, more loving, more careful with the feelings of others than I had given her credit for, maybe more careful than she should have been, though that is her call to make and not mine. I also found out that an 81-year-old woman in a yellow house on Harmon Avenue has been keeping half of my wife's heart warm for longer than I have been married to her, and that instead of making me feel diminished by that, it makes me feel, in some way I don't have the right words for, grateful. Grateful that Diane had somewhere to put the thing. Grateful that Eleanor answered the phone. Grateful that the grief had an address. If you've read this far, thank you. I wrote this because I needed to put it somewhere outside myself, and also because I think there are people who love each other for a very long time and assume the loving means the knowing, and I wanted to say, as gently as I can, go ask the question. Whatever Tuesday your person has been taking, go ask about it. Not with suspicion, with curiosity, with the assumption that whatever's there is not a threat but a room, and the room is part of who they are, and you are allowed to knock.